Please join me in God's shout. Namo Amida Butsu.
Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.
I'm nervous. I don't usually get nervous when I speak, so this is a new feeling, so sorry. Good morning or afternoon, depending on how you're feeling. Thank you all for coming to this wonderful event, and thank you to all those who are joining us online. I also want to thank Reverend Candace Shibata for going first. Just ripping the Band-Aid off, I appreciate it. But I also, thanks for adding to my anxiety. You did wonderful. I want to follow that. I'd also like to thank our organizers, Sumi, Judy, Michiko, Hitomi Sensei, Reverend Sensei, Sharon Sensei, and Sarah, who put in so much effort in planning to make this event happen, and also for the opportunity to speak today. I'm just barely out of my first year as a full-time minister, so this is quite an honor. And I also really appreciate the many efforts that are done on our behalf by those that we do not see. So events like these, don't happen just with a committee, right? Like they happen through many hands, many planning, the grant donation. And so there's lots of things, both seen and unseen, to be grateful for in this moment. And so I've entitled my talk, Finding Our Way on a Trodden Path. Some of you may know how I came to Buddhism, if you attended like the crossing over event or one of those. But for those that don't, I will relay a bit of that story. But ultimately, my path is just one of many possible ways. Reverend Shibata's path is another. And for each of us, in the way in which we have decided to become ministers, whether male or female, is unique and personal. Each person who chooses to engage with the teachings in this way really has to come to understand their own reasonings or aspiration, no matter what the roadmap looks like. And it may seem like there are but a few ways, this path that has been forged by others, but I want us to rethink of how we consider our journey into the teachings, how we view the worn path before us, and how we express the gratitude we have for this precious life. As I express my journey to you, I want to focus more on the feelings that came up when I encountered in terms of leadership and how I saw myself in those places, versus the larger aspects of faith that I have shared in the past. As I consider the spiritual side of the journey, I will simply say that I've spent many years being lost and unsure. But Shinran Shonen's words in Tanisho, chapter 2, which state, I have no idea whether the Nembutsu is truly the seed of my being born in the Pure Land, or whether it is a karmic act for which I might fall into hell. Should I have been deceived by Master Honen in saying the Nembutsu were to fall into hell, even then I would have no regrets. He goes on to say, the reason is, if I could attain Buddhahood by endeavoring in other practices, but said the Nembutsu and so fell into hell, then I would feel regret at having been deceived. But I am incapable of other practice, so hell is decidedly my abode, whatever I do. These are words that help me understand why I feel solidly on the ground of entrustment to the Nembutsu path, no matter how divergent it was to get here. At least far more solidly than I ever experienced in Christianity. Jodo Shinshu has allowed me to see myself in a way I was not capable of before, and this ever-deepening understanding of my own limitations, my ego that rears up and gets in the way, becomes a source for gratitude. And I have to laugh a little as I share a quote that references hell 4 times. 4 times. Of course, the concept of hell in Buddhism is different than a Christian hell, but nonetheless, the idea of hell was something that not only terrified me as a child, but stayed with me deep into my adulthood. And as I struggled to come to terms with my sexuality, health was a concept, or hell, not health. Hell was a concept. Hell was a concept concept that lingered and caused tremendous damage. And I can find comfort now in such a quote. And I think that for me, that is just but one way I feel that the Nembutsu in action within my life, how it has shifted something that was so deeply troubling to me and painful. Now I can joke about it, right? I can say, hell, 4 times. I'm like, yes, no problem, let's go. The faith I was born into was Catholicism. As a kid, the church was a fairly significant part of my maternal family's life. We attended Mass on Sundays and catechism classes, which prepared me for many of the important rituals that are in the church. You learn how to give your first confession and take a communion, and later in my teenage years, I took classes for confirmation ceremony. It's a commitment to live a Catholic life. Oopsie-daisies. When I was young, I told my mother I wanted to be a priest. And she informed me that women were not allowed to be priests, but they could be nuns. Being a nun didn't have the same draw that priesthood did. They really didn't have the cool clothes or get to do anything fun, or it didn't look like it. And I felt disappointed. No one ever explained why women weren't capable of serving the church in that role. And as I got older, I realized women didn't really seem to get to do any of the cool stuff. They taught classes, answered phones. Once in a while, they got to bring forward the communion offerings during service, but they were always accompanied by their husbands and children. I grew up in a single-parent family, so we were never invited forward. When I left for college, I had had very little exposure to other religions, but I knew I was ready to be done with Catholicism. It didn't feel like a good fit. In fact, church no longer, in general, felt like it had the intrigue it once did. So off I went, consciously planning on not being any particular faith at all. But once I got to college, I was lonely, and I was having trouble adjusting to the new experience. I've always made friends easily, but doubting I would be able to do so now is something that nestled really deeply inside me. No one in my family had gone to college before, so everything was new. It was a lot to take in, and I didn't really feel able to lean on anyone for support. When I walked by a table with a few friendly people asking if I wanted to attend a Bible study in my dorm, I said no. I continued to struggle with the changes I encountered. As a music major, I had multiple music classes throughout the week, and I was trying to fit in my general education requirements. But I wasn't the top musician any longer, and I missed my friends and the way things used to be. I considered transferring to be closer to my best friend and even flew out to Tacoma for a scholarship audition. But as the quarter carried on, I started to meet new people, including a few folks from that same Bible group that had initially tried to get me to come. Some of them actually lived on the same floor as me in my dorm. One was my RA and another was my neighbor 2 doors down. It seemed like something to do, a way to meet people, and I figured if I went, they would eventually stop asking. So it was like a little quid pro quo. I'll go, you leave me alone. And InterVarsity Christian Fellowship is that group that I encountered. Currently, it states on their website that it's a campus community that helps students and faculty follow Jesus with their whole lives, for the rest of their lives. And so once in a while, when I talk about my past, I get a little curious about what's happening in InterVarsity, and I'll look at their website or kind of get stuck down a rabbit hole. I think maybe it's a little bit like looking up an ex after a breakup, and I'm certain that it's not healthy to do. This might be, like if you're a social media person, a little Facebook stalking here and there, just to see what's going on. But when I was in college, and then I discovered in this little search that my college chapter no longer exists. It's now defunct. The person inside me that's not the great person is like, yeah. But when I was at my college, however, InterVarsity was thriving, and it would ask students to become Bible study leaders. You were trained by former students who were now working for InterVarsity. It's kind of a weird, kind of difficult process to encounter or to describe their internal structure. But if you said yes to becoming a Bible study leader, you were asked to live in the dorms and minister to fellow students. This is why I continue to encounter the group. From a proselytizing standpoint, it's kind of clever, right? Like, maybe we should get Jodo Shinshu Buddhists to come to church. The student leadership and InterVarsity staff was led by both men and women, something I hadn't seen before, and there was even a little bit of diversity. As a Catholic, I had never even owned a Bible, and here everybody owned one and carried it around and quoted it. And there were so many new things and ways to be involved. It was actually kind of exciting. I was asked eventually onto leadership team my sophomore year, and then almost all, it just seemed like all of a sudden, all of my friends were part of the organization. By my junior year, by the way, I'm describing a cult. Just so you know, isolated. That's a whole other Dharma talk. Sorry, I digress. But my junior year, so I was a Bible study leader and a worship leader. I had left my major of music education. It took up too much time and took me away from my college ministry, and I switched to English. I even considered a minor in religion and had started taking classes to fulfill that. But it started bringing up big questions for me. Some things started not to make sense. But then I was encouraged by a fellow Bible study leader who was a year older than me not to ask questions because nothing good would come of it. So I stopped. But by my senior year, the questions were getting bigger and I just wasn't vocalizing them. I didn't ask anyone, but maybe they came out in other ways. To my religion professor in the papers I was writing. And so one day, Dr. Kenny, one of my religion professors, asked if he could sit with me on the steps where I was eating a sandwich and enjoying the weather. As we chatted, he said, "You know, I was like you at your age. I had a hippie bus and drove around preaching the gospel." And I was surprised when he told me this. There were rumors he had been excommunicated from the Catholic Church for being a heretic. And if you'd ever attended any classes, you would understand why that rumor was there. I never found out if it was true. These seem to be the type of rumors that go around about teachers. And as we spoke, I asked him what changed. And he simply said, "I woke up." At that time, I didn't give it a lot of thought. I was too self-assured and embedded in the life I had. To be wrong meant I had royally screwed up, and that I had securely placed myself on a path to nowhere. When I left college without the job with InterVarsity I had been led to believe was waiting for me, I was lost. I was told it was because they were no longer taking white women. I was surprised to be called a white woman at this time because they had been counting me in their census as Native American for 4 years. I was too fat, which was ungodly. And they thought I was gay. I mean, they got me on that one. But I had to come to terms with that. And I wish I could say that the sudden proverbial slap to the face would have been the wake-up call Dr. Kenny had told me about. But it wasn't. Instead, I saw it as a gatekeeping and harmful leadership. Since I was told that the job offer was not coming because the things about me they didn't want, it came from an answer from God that they had prayed for. And I asked why God was delivering 2 different messages, and there was no answer. It wasn't until many more hurts, a difficult coming out experience, and an invitation to leave the church I was serving due to my sexuality that I was finally able to delve into my questions. At first, I believed what I was being told by others, that my doubts were caused by the hurts of people and not by God. But as I read and finally started to listen, I realized I didn't believe in God. It didn't make sense. As a woman, there wasn't space for me. And as a gay woman, I would always be in sin if I chose to be in relationship. Even if I could close the door on my doubts, I would never be accepted for who I was. And once I admitted that, all the pain and confusion began to make sense. And so several years passed and lots of other experiences, but finally one day, I found myself sitting in a Jodo Shinshu temple, chanting for the first time, and I cried. Something clicked inside, and I think this is when I finally really finally woke up. As a convert to Buddhism, I feel a commonality with Shinran Shonin that I never felt in the stories of the Bible. There's a deep respect for him, and his sincerity, longing, and enduring is so relatable. Shinran Shonin was a seeker, longing for a path that awakened him, that would meet him at his capabilities. It is said that, and I quote from the Honganji website, when he was 29, Shinran undertook nightly retreats at Rokukudo Temple in Kyoto to determine his future course. At dawn on the 95th day, Prince Shotoku appeared to him in a dream. Shinran took this as a sign that he should seek out Honin, and went to hear his teaching daily for 100 days. He then abandoned his former Tendai practices and joined Honin's movement. I was 34 when I stumbled into the Spokane Temple, 5 years older than Shinran. It had taken me longer to get where I needed to be. I wasn't able to sequester myself to learn because I had to go to work, but I did begin attending service every Sunday. I went to every class and workshop that was offered, and what I kept hearing was, you needed to find a teacher. At my first year in the temple, as my first year in finishing up at the temple, we were moving into the late summer. Our volunteer Kyoshi minister had left the temple, leaving the two ministers' assistants to try and conduct service each week. One had ill health and the other had pressing family issues, making a weekly commitment difficult. Reverend Paul Viel, a retired Tokudo's minister, stepped back in to help, but the temple was struggling. At this point, I was unaware of the unspoken process of how a minister's assistant is invited to study, and since then I've found out it's different at every single temple. I very ignorantly wanted to learn more, and I wanted to help. So I sheepishly went up to Paul one day after service, and I asked him if I could work towards becoming a minister's assistant. I assuredly caught him off guard. I'm not even sure he knew my name. And I can understand now how a year at the temple is hardly any time at all. But for me, I also felt so assured. The time felt inconsequential. I had found what I was looking for. And I don't really remember what he said, but I recall feeling like I had messed up. I didn't ask again, and a few months ticked by, so I decided to try and get into the Jodo Shinshu correspondence course. This was before it was the rolling enrollment, when you're just like waiting at the clock, like, can I get in this thing? And so as I was trying to get in is when they started changing the system. And so I was like put on the wait list for like a year and a half out. And I was disappointed, but I was like, I'm gonna stick through with this. And then suddenly one day, Paul asked if I would like to meet with Reverend Castro on his next visit, our supervising minister at the time. Myself, another temple member, and his wife showed up on a Saturday afternoon for a Q&A about the MA program. The next day, we had a barbecue and potluck. I was standing in line with the temple member and his wife that had also been at the Q&A. She had been raised Jodo Shinshu in California and began telling me that several years before, she had asked to be an MA and was told by the minister who had left that you can't ask, you have to be invited. And she would now never be invited. I later found out that the two had butted some heads and had a little beef, so I think there was more to it than that. But I had that sinking feeling in that moment that I had again misstepped and had done something wrong. In my mind, I just wanted to learn and I just wanted to help, but I didn't know enough to understand the history of what had happened at the temple or what others felt was the correct way to go about something. When we consider the past before us and what others have done, there's an aspect of wanting to ensure we are being thoughtful and honoring of the traditions before us. But there's also a point where we can get stuck thinking or saying there is only one way. So if we stop for a moment and rewind the tape to a little over 2,500 years ago, we would find ourselves at the formation of what would become Buddhism. From this time of his birth, after losing his mother, Queen Maya, the Buddha's aunt was also his stepmother, enters the picture and returns several times, imparting to us many insights and understanding of the Buddha himself, but also the time and place they inhabit. These nuggets of clarity help inform and teach us about the role women played and how they were viewed. In Wendy Garland's book, The Woman Who Raised the Buddha, she brings to life Mahaprajapati Gautami. We most often hear of Gautami's life, not to be confused with Kisa Gautami, the distraught woman who lost her child, in two ways: that of being a caretaker and mother to the Buddha, and as the woman who requested women be allowed to ordain as nuns. To paint a quick and precise picture as to the predicament in which Gautami found herself, in a previous story, the Buddha had returned home to dispute issues over water rights and the consequences of delivering the teachings and stopping this slaughter that was about to happen of the two sides warring. He taught the teachings of wisdom and compassion. And the 500 men that were going to fight, 250 from each side, listened to those teachings, but also alongside their wives, sisters, and mothers. And it made them want to leave and take monastic orders. And this left a number of women without heads of the household, a true problem for women in this culture and at this time. Later, after the Buddha's father dies, Queen Gautami finds herself in the same position as those 500 abandoned wives, mothers, and sisters. Although a number of early sutras make reference to Gautami's request for ordination, the one I was most familiar with had her requesting ordination for herself and the 500 women on 3 separate occasions, only to be granted the request after intervention from Ananda and additional rules that were just for the nuns, and Buddhism being available for a lesser time. Garland, however, points out the number of variations and lesser-known texts that highlight Gautami and accompanies great joy and desire to follow the Buddha and his teachings. It was not simply about need for safety and community after being left, but out of their own desire and want to continue hearing the teachings, to stay in the Buddha's orbit and to learn. They were just as moved to seek a path of liberation as their male counterparts, and had wished to enter the monastic life at the same time. Having heard the teachings alongside their husbands, brothers, and sons, they found truth and a way out of suffering. It wasn't until I took Dr. Paula Arai's class on women in Buddhism that I had heard someone pose the question, does this misogynistic view and telling of the nun's story convey the deep wisdom and compassion of the Buddha? Garland further states on this point, the view here is that misogyny has no place in a true telling of the origin of the women's monastic order. It's not that we don't see the patriarchy, often misogyny existed in early Buddhism, or that these elements became amplified by later editors and flowed into the androcentric narratives that have come down to us. But if we valorize the first Buddhist women and imagine how they might have told their stories, we can begin by no longer dignifying the literature that disparages them. Perhaps this part of the path we encounter is a bit like quicksand for us. The more we stay and struggle in the places where wisdom and compassion seems to be lacking, the deeper we will sink, as will others. Passages that disparage women come at a price for the positive role our gender has played and the deep lasting impacts that have been made. In fact, we could spend a lot of time discussing passages like these, the difficulty in interpreting the 35th vow, or how the contributions of our Bamori, the temple guardians, often the wives of ministers, have been largely ignored and undervalued. Once I was able to make it through my first missteps of entering into the minister's assistant program, I was met with wonderful and supportive teachers. I found that compared to the religious spaces I had been in, Buddhism was far more progressive. But that doesn't give it a free pass. Many of the difficulties I encountered centered around my own ignorance. And that's true in my life now, that's not going anywhere. And I seldom ran into issues because of my gender. Instead, I found a very nurturing environment in our practice. After Tokido, something new began to stir inside me, and it was a willingness to consider full-time ministry. There was a lot of fear in entertaining that idea. For one, I had finally found a successful career in finance, and I was actually making some money. I worked in an independent bookstore for 10 years, so you can see the difference. And then the other centered around my past hurts. Allowing BCA to be in control of where I would live and take my family and enter into the uncertainty of full-time ministry hit on a lot of past hurts. The desire to spend more time in ministry and the support and nurturing I received alleviated some of those fears. I've taken us in a lot of directions in this short time we've had together, and hopefully it feels short to you. But I want to try and tie it all together. Part of why I have told you about my story is not just for you to get to know me and how my unconventional path led me to becoming a full-time minister. I do hope it encourages you to think about the many non-traditional and traditional ways we can come to the same point, but to show what the power of feeling safe in a space with others can bring out, and more importantly, the sheer joy that arises from knowing you are in the right place. The Nembutsu is this powerful, transformative force that we have done nothing to earn, and feeling the embrace of the wisdom and compassion of the Buddha allows for this outflowing of gratitude that we might want to put somewhere. The excitement of it might result in you feeling like you overstepped, or you put yourself out there too much. If you need to, you can always apologize and continue to work towards your goal. Shinran Shonen teaches us to step out of the known and into the unknown, that it's okay to test the waters and to change course. Stepping into deep reflection, taking time to assess ourselves and where we are at and where we want to go, can not only result in your own happiness, but it can result in others' happiness, in creating something that benefits others. We are all receiving that gift today because Shinran Shonen walked down the mountain. Gotami teaches us to push past the status quo, to not only ask for more, but for what is right. For those that don't know, Gotami becomes a great nun with an incredible understanding of the Dharma and abilities beyond many of the monks. She was a great leader, and she cared deeply for the other nuns and helped to guide them to enlightenment. She reveals to us what we can do once we feel invited to the table. The Buddha himself in this situation was a gatekeeper. He had access to something others didn't, and he had the ability to either bring others along or to stop them. As a gatekeeper, he was responsible for discerning how to move the path forward, but to also benefit as many people as possible. He had to have awareness, concern for safety, and the longevity of Buddhism. As people in leadership, or who would like to lead, we too have the possibility of being gatekeepers. How do we want to help others? How can we wield our power, in whatever form that may be, to ensure our tradition represents true equality? As I ventured down the ministerial path and things shifted into moving into full-time ministry, it is not something I did alone. With the assistance of guidance or mentors, teachers, friends, and Sangha, both locally and throughout our tradition, I received support. How do we pay that forward when it's our turn to do so? And I have deep gratitude to ministers like Reverend Kodo Omezu, Bishop Harada, Reverend Harano, Reverend Bridge, and Reverend Kuwahara, as well as Paul Sensei and Reverend Kusunoki, just to name a few. But you'll notice the names that I read are all men. And it's a reminder, however, that on one hand, we may lament the absence of women in my studies, we can also be thankful that the men we have in leadership are holding the door open for female ministers and assisting and not hindering the development of those who are coming through now and in the future. Without their support, we would not be seeing the changes that is beginning to take form in our ministry. When I went to BCSF for my first interview, they took me on a tour of the building, and in the hallway near the office is a wall of pictures. And it's a wall of pictures. Part of the wall displayed many of the past ministers, and the other part was the past board presidents. Looking over the pictures, I had several feelings. The first was happiness when I saw Reverend, the founder of the Spokane Buddhist temple. I felt a deep comfort in seeing his portrait that I saw every Sunday and many days in Spokane. And then I saw Reverend Castro's portrait, my first supervising minister, and it was also a welcoming sight. It made me feel like maybe I was destined to come to BCSM. But I looked at his picture, I noticed he was the only non-Japanese minister on the wall. And then I saw there were no pictures of female ministers. There was no precedent at BCSF for someone like me. It wasn't a deterrent by any means, but I felt the moment of what it could mean to be the first openly queer female minister. It made me wonder how many of our other temples have never had a female resident minister in their history, and what sort of unique challenges it would present. There are still places for us to grow and change to ensure we are representing our membership in positions that can visibly impact change, and you may be that person whose voice we may need to hear. The trodden path we find in front of us has been forged by those who walked it, following the calling voice of the Buddha. It is a beautiful and joyful thing to either happen upon or to follow in the steps we have been directed by the people who loved us and sacrificed on our behalf, even before we were born. But now is the time to allow the deep roots to flourish. As women, I think it is safe to say our insecurities and doubt often hinder us and we hesitate. I constantly struggle about whether or not I'm enough, or the imposter syndrome that nags at me when the bravery of Gautami, as well as the many examples of strong-willed devout women who have come before us, remains a guiding light. But also the all-embracing wisdom and compassion of Amida Buddha, the Nembutsu, the come as you are, just as you are path is here before us now. Let us walk it with our heads held high and allow the depth of our gratitude to guide our actions. Please join me in Joshua. Namo Amida Butsu.
Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.